He came with paper, she stayed with ground. That was the whole of it in the end, though. Idella Voss would not understand this until she was standing in an abandoned barn in August heat, with a candle flame bending toward a pipe and a thermometer reading 56 degrees against a sky that had been pushing 90 for 3 weeks running. She would understand it then with the particular clarity that comes not from being told a thing, but from building it with your hands and watching it hold against everything the season delivers. But that was August. This was June. This was a Tuesday morning with the grasshoppers clicking in the dry grass along the county road and two men on horseback coming down toward the Voss farm and Idella's mother already at the kitchen table with her palms pressed flat against the wood. Cecilia Voss had known since April. The third notice from the bank had arrived on a Wednesday, and she had read it at the same table in the same posture with the same deliberate stillness she had maintained since Jonas Voss died in January. Grief in women like Cecilia did not announce itself. It settled. It became the angle of her shoulders at the window, the particular quality of silence that had filled the house for 5 months. The way she held a cup as though the warmth of it was the only warmth available, and she intended to make it last. Idella had watched her mother carry that silence and had said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. She was 18 years old. She had grown up on 300 acres of good bottom ground in Holt County, Kansas, and she knew how to mend fence-turned garden soil, red weather coming in from the west work, a full day without complaint. What she did not know was what to do when the thing being lost was not a crop or a season, but the ground itself. She heard the horses before she reached the window. Harlan Aldrich rode with the easy posture of a man accustomed to being received. He wore a good wool coat despite the June heat, a deliberate choice that told you everything about how he thought of himself in relation to other people. Beside him, Sheriff Dwight Crane rode with his eyes on the middle distance, which was its own kind of information. Crane was a decent man performing a legal function. There is a particular cowardice in that combination. It looks exactly like following the rules, because it is. Aldrich came to the door with a leather satchel and the efficiency of someone who had performed this task before and did not expect complications. The documents were organized, the numbers were correct, the title was held by the bank. The debt was outstanding, 3 harvests running, stacked on the original loan like stones on a grave. 7 days to remove personal belongings. Cecilia said nothing. She had run out of words for this somewhere in April, and the intervening weeks had not replenished them. Idella spoke. She told him they would be gone by morning. Aldrich looked at her the way men look at 18-year-olds who speak with more certainty than their years have purchased a brief flicker of something between amusement and assessment, the calculation of a man deciding whether a response was worth his time. He decided it was not. He closed the satchel, nodded once, turned back to his horse. Crane sat his mount the entire time without meeting her eyes. They rode back up the county road the way they had come, and the dust settled behind them, and the kitchen was very quiet. Cecilia turned from the window. What Idella saw on her mother's face was not grief. She had seen grief on that face all winter, and she knew its shape. This was something else. The look of a woman who has been carrying a weight for so long that the muscles have finally given out, and she is standing with the weight still on her, and she is looking at the one person she believes strong enough to take some of it, knowing that the taking will cost that person something she cannot repay. Idella was not strong enough. She would discover over the coming weeks that she was stronger than she had believed, which is not the same thing at all. She began moving food before the sun was fully committed to rising the next morning. The logic was simple, and she did not spend time examining it. Whatever happened to the farm and the house and the deed, the food her mother had put up over 2 summers of careful work belonged to the family that had done the work. The law could have the land. It could not have the 60 jars of preserved beans and tomatoes and plums, the sacks of dried corn, the salt pork in its crock, the flour and the salt, the hams hanging in the smokehouse that smelled of hickory in winter, and every careful morning her mother had spent getting the smoke right. She moved everything by wheelbarrow along the backfield road 2 miles each way in the blue hour before dawn, when the sky was not yet committed to morning. The Abernathy place had stood empty for more than a decade, the family gone after 2 failed crops. In a death, the barn's roof sagging at the northwest corner, but the walls sound the main floor solid. No one owned it in any active sense. No one was watching it. She took a different route each morning so the wheel tracks would not form a readable path. Her mother watched the first morning from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed against the pre-dawn chill, her face doing something Idella could not quite read. The second morning, Cecilia came with her, carrying 2 jars at a time, without speaking. She did not ask where they were going, or why the particular building, or how long Idella intended to keep this up. She simply came and carried and turned back with the empty wheelbarrow, while Idella started on the next load, and the silence between them was the kind that does not require filling. On the fourth morning, Idella moved the tools, the short-handled spade, the hatchet, the coil of rope, the hand saw, the lantern, the box of tallow candles. She took the spare shoring timbers her grandfather had cut and stored under a tarp behind the main barn, the lengths of iron pipe he had set aside for a project he had not quite finished before his health made finishing impossible. She took the dairy thermometer he had hung on the earthen wall of the cellar. He had started an old instrument, mercury still accurate. She hung it on a nail in her coat pocket and walked the 2 miles in the gray early morning, and she did not look back at the house. She needed to tell you about Harmon Voss. He had been a coal miner most of his working life, the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania, starting at 15 underground for 35 years, until his lungs presented their accounting in terms that left no room for negotiation. He came out of that life with black permanently lodged in the creases of his knuckles and a knowledge of the underground that was as intimate as any knowledge Idella had ever witnessed between a person and a place. Not mystical, practical. The specificity of a man who had paid attention underground for decades because inattention in a mine shaft was how men died. He could read the earth the way some people read sky. He pressed the ball of his boot into soil and told you things about what lay beneath it in terms that were precise and actionable. He had come west with the family in the late 1860s when the Homestead Act was still writing its bright promise across flat land, and he had taken to farming with the same unhurried attention he had given the coal patient with material that does not negotiate. Methodical in the way of men who have learned that the earth rewards careful observation and punishes the shortcuts. He farmed for 15 years and was good at it. He died in the winter of 1882, 2 years before the bank came for the Voss farm, and he left Idella very little. A pair of worn leatherwork gloves with the left thumb worn through a root cellar. He had half finished behind the main barn. A way of thinking about the ground that she had not yet understood was worth more than the farm itself. The cellar was the thing. He had begun it the summer before he died, telling Idella's father it was practical. Telling Idella it was important, not quite finishing either explanation before his health made long conversations difficult. It was dug 8 feet into the earth behind the main barn, 12 feet by 10 feet across, with notched timber shoring along the walls and 2 lengths of iron pipe set into the earthen walls. One pipe ran from near the floor outward through the wall, angling upward to emerge behind a stand of juniper 40 feet from the barn. The other rose from near the ceiling and ran up through the barn wall, venting below the eaves on the north face. He had fitted a wooden trap door at the top of the steep entry steps with an iron latch that caught with a sound like something being decided. He brought Idella down into it one evening in August, the summer before he died. She was 15. The cellar smelled of earth and cool mineral and something deeper that had no name she could give it. The temperature dropped as they descended in a way that was immediate and noticeable. She said so. Her grandfather set his hand flat against the earthen wall. Not cold, girl. Even. There's a difference worth your life. He told her about thermal mass, how the dense earth absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, insulating the interior from the extremes above. At 8 feet of depth, the temperature in a Kansas root cellar stayed within a narrow range, regardless of season, cool enough to preserve food through summer, warm enough to prevent freezing through winter. He told her about the ventilation pipes, how cool, heavier air entered through the low pipe, while warm, moist air escaped through the high one, creating a slow, continuous circulation that kept condensation from forming on stored food and mold from taking hold in still air. A root cellar is not a hole in the ground, he said, holding the lantern so she could see the timber work along the walls. It is a pocket of yesterday's weather. The earth is always a season behind the sky. It remembers what the sky has already forgotten. Idella had nodded. She had helped arrange the shelving boards, carried the first jars of preserved food down the steep steps, believed she understood. She did not understand. She had heard the words, filed them in the back of her mind where useful things waited for the emergency that would require them, and gone back upstairs to her ordinary life. That life ended on a Tuesday in June of 1884. The emergency had arrived. The Abernathy barn was larger than she remembered from childhood. The loft still held sweet, dry hay. The tack room had a broken door that swung in the wind, opening and closing against the frame, with a rhythm that the first few nights she mistook for footsteps. In the far corner where the old milking stalls had been, the earthen floor was shielded from any sight line to the main doors. That was where she began. She marked the space with a coil of rope 12 feet by 10 feet, 8 feet deep. Those were the dimensions her grandfather had used, and she trusted them because they were the only specifications she had. She had no expertise of her own. She had a dead man's instructions, a pair of worn gloves, the specific desperation of a person who has surveyed all available alternatives and found them insufficient. The work began on a Monday morning in late June, with the sun already hot at 7 in the morning and the grasshoppers clicking in the dry grass outside the barn. Nothing she had done in 18 years prepared her for the physical reality of digging 8 feet into Kansas clay. She had worked hard her whole life, turned garden soil every spring, hauled water-mended fence, done the 100 physical tasks of farm life without complaint or particular difficulty. This was different in kind, not just degree. Kansas clay came up in chunks that resisted the spade with a sullenness that felt personal. Each bucket weighed more than she expected. The ladder was steeper than seemed reasonable. The sun moved across the sky with a slowness that made time feel like something being done to her, deliberately a punishment for an infraction she could not identify. She moved 10 buckets before her hands were raw, 20 before the rawness became a burn that made her set the spade down and breathe carefully, 30 before she understood that the burn was not going to stop her, that the only real question was what kind of person she was going to discover herself to be in the working through it. She scattered the displaced earth in a low gully 100 yards from the barn, working it into the natural contours of the land so there was no telltale mound. Her grandfather had mentioned this once, almost in passing, that a cellar you wanted to keep private required that you disperse what you removed. She had filed that detail in the same back corner where she filed most of what he told her. She retrieved it now and put it to use, grateful in a way she had not expected to be for the specificity of a dead man's casual observations. By the end of the first day, she had 3 feet of depth hands that bled when she flexed them aback with opinions about her choices, and the beginning of something she could not yet name, but could feel in the way her body settled into sleep that night, a heaviness that was not entirely unpleasant, the exhaustion of a person who has spent a day in honest contact with a real problem. She lay in the loft of the Abernathy barn in the sweet dry hay and thought about her grandfather going underground at 15 in a Pennsylvania coal mine and doing it every day for 35 years, and something in the vicinity of peace found her before sleep did. The blisters on her palms broke and healed and broke again over the first week. She developed a rhythm, 3 hours of digging in the cooler morning air, an hour dispersing clay in the gully, then the slower work of setting shoring timbers along the walls as the hole deepened. She ate sparingly. She repaired gaps in the barn walls with rags and dried mud in the evenings, and went to sleep with the particular tiredness of a body used honestly all day, which is different from the tiredness of a body used badly. Different in quality, different in what it leaves behind when it lifts. The second week brought the first real failure. She had been shoring the walls as she went driving timber planks vertically into the clay to prevent collapse, following what she understood to be the standard method. Her grandfather had mentioned shoring, but she had retained only the general concept, not the specifics. On the night of the 9th day, a hard rain came from the northwest, the kind that builds in the afternoon and breaks at night with a seriousness that turns roads to mud and tests every structure's claim to soundness. She was in the loft when she heard it, a low, wet, settling sound from below. The particular note of something giving way under pressure, a sound she had never heard before but recognized immediately, the way the body sometimes recognizes danger before the mind has time to classify it. She came down with the lantern and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at what the rain had done. The east wall had collapsed. Nearly 4 feet of clay had sheared away in a single heavy slab, taking 2 of her vertical shoring planks with it. The bucket she had left at the bottom was buried. 3 days of work undone in a night. She sat on the edge of the hole with the rain coming through gaps in the roof and dripping onto her shoulders, and looked at the ruin of what she had built. She let herself feel it for a few minutes without trying to convert it into something useful, without reaching for the lesson or the silver lining or the practical next step. She sat with the fact of the failure, which is harder than it sounds, because the mind wants to move. She made it stay. Then she thought about her grandfather, thought about something specific he had told her that she had not fully understood at the time. He had been explaining the difference between driving timber straight into a wall and notching them to interlock. She had been half listening in the way you half listen to technical details that have no context yet, hearing the shape of the information without the substance. He had said the earth moves sideways under pressure, not down. You build your shoring to work with that tendency, not against it. Straight planks transmit the pressure from above, straight through to the unstable earth below. Notched timbers locked into horizontal plates distribute the force laterally across the whole face of the wall. The wall becomes a single object instead of a collection of individual planks. She had not cut the notches. That was the error, not ignorance of the concept, but failure to apply the critical detail that made the concept actually work. She had taken the idea of shoring and applied the rough shape of it without the thing that gave the shape its function. She got up, found the hatchet in the rubble at the bottom of the hole, started clearing. It took 4 days to rebuild the collapsed section correctly. She cut every shoring timber with notched ends, fitting them into horizontal plates top and bottom, creating the interlocking frame her grandfather had described. The work was slower and more exacting than anything she had done before. She ruined 3 timbers getting the notch angle right before she had a method that produced consistent results. When the rebuilt section was finally done, she pressed her palm flat against the new shoring and pushed with everything she had. Nothing moved. She stood at the bottom of the hole in the lantern light and felt something that was not triumph, something quieter and more durable than triumph. Recognition. The difference between a thing she had been told and a thing she now knew with her hands. The wall had failed. She had not. Her grandfather had tried to give her this knowing in words, and she had received only the outline of it. The 4 lost days in the ruined timbers and the clay in her hair at midnight were the price of converting the outline into substance, of learning the difference between hearing a principle and understanding it well enough to rebuild what you have built wrong. She understood standing at the bottom of that rebuilt hole what he had been trying to give her 3 years before. Not cold girl, even. He had not been teaching her about temperature. He had been teaching her a way of thinking about the difference between what fluctuates and what holds about the reliability of the earth versus the unreliability of the sky, about building your life on the thing that keeps rather than the thing that changes with the season. The earth is even. It holds what it is given and releases it slowly and can be relied upon in a way the sky with its droughts, its blizzards, its grasshopper years has never managed. The sky is weather. The earth is memory. Build your life accordingly. July moved through its heat with the indifference of a Kansas July committed to its purpose. The sky stayed pale and hard. The creek along the southern edge of the Abernathy land dropped steadily, its banks expanding as the water retreated, leaving cracked mud margins where the grass had been. She watched the wheat in the surrounding fields grow to a height that suggested a decent harvest, but the stalks were thinner than they should have been, the heads lighter. The kind of crop that feeds you for 1 year without building any reserve for the next. She provisioned through the long heat. Wild plums from the thickets along the creek cooked into preserves over a stone ring fire behind the barn, out of sight of the county road. A week of canning help exchanged with Vera Garner, who farmed the adjacent property with her husband and 3 children, and came from Ohio and had shed several layers of social convention in the process of surviving Kansas, and asked no unnecessary questions and paid exactly what she agreed to pay, which made her exceptional in Idella's experience. 3 days of fence mending for a farmer named Willis, 2 miles east, in exchange for 2 additional lengths of stovepipe and a flat soapstone that would serve as a small heater in the barn through winter. She mended the roof on the northwest corner with shingles stacked in the tack room, sealed gaps in the barn walls with a mixture of clay and dried grass, carried water from the creek in the mornings when it still ran, and stored it in the barrel she had brought from the Voss farm. Through all of it, she moved with the methodical pace of someone who has learned that panic wastes the same hours as calm and produces worse work. She finished the ventilation system on the 14th of August. Following her grandfather's design exactly, she dug two narrow channels from the cellar walls outward and fitted the iron pipes into them. The low pipe emerged behind a stand of scrub brush 40 feet from the barn, angled so rain would not run directly into the opening, but air could move freely through it. The high pipe ran up through the barn wall inside a notched channel she had cut into one of the main uprights, venting just below the eaves on the north face. The work was precise because it had to be a pipe set at the wrong angle, would collect water instead of moving air, and a ventilation system that collected water was worse than no ventilation at all. The test was simple. She lit a candle at the low pipe opening and held it steady. The flame bent inward. She watched it for a long time without moving. Then she went down the stairs to the bottom and checked the dairy thermometer she had hung on the earthen wall. 56 degrees. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the barn's south face read 91. She sat on the overturned crate in the cool underground air and did not move for a long while. She was not thinking about the numbers, though the numbers were real, and she had thought about them often enough in the weeks of work leading to this moment. She was feeling the meaning of them in her body, the underground steadiness surrounding her while the summer pressed against the barn walls above with a weight that felt almost aggressive. 35 degrees of difference between the world that could see her and the world that could keep her. Her grandfather had told her this would be so. He had told her in that root cellar 3 years ago, lantern between them, his hand flat against the earthen wall. The words had reached her then. The understanding had not. Now it had. She sat there longer than she needed to. Then she placed her palms on the cool stone floor and spoke quietly into the cellar air. Not prayer exactly, not conversation exactly, but something with qualities of both the way you speak to someone who cannot answer but whose absence has not made them less present. "You were right about all of it, Grandpa Harmon," she said. The cool air moved in its slow circuit through the pipes above her, indifferent to grief, indifferent to season, indifferent to everything except the physics of warm air rising and cool air filling the space it left. It had been doing this since before she arrived. It would continue after she left. That was the point. That was what he had built and what she had finished and what would hold through whatever the sky decided to deliver. She was ready. By the end of August, the cellar shelves held 64 jars of preserved food beans, tomatoes, plums, beets, alongside the sacks of dried corn and flour and salt. The salt pork and its crock-braided onions hung from the ceiling. Joyce, a small hard wheel of cheese. She drove a nail into the earthen wall near the foot of the stairs and hung the dairy thermometer on it. Then she went back outside for the last of the daylight. That was when she saw the grasshoppers. Not in number, not yet. In behavior. They were clustering on the warm south face of the barn wall in the late afternoon, bodies oriented in a direction that made her stomach go cold. Grouped rather than dispersed. Resting with a quality she associated with preparation rather than ease. Her grandfather had described this once. He had heard it from men who had witnessed a swarm in the years before she was born, the days before the main body arrived, how the local insects gathered as though called by something humans could not hear, resting on warm surfaces with bodies pointed toward the southwest. The air taking on a brittle, dry quality like something held at tension. He had told it with the specificity of a man who understood that precise details lodge in memory in a way that generalities never manage. She had been a child when he told her. She had retained it because of how he told it. Standing in the late August afternoon watching a line of grasshoppers on the south wall, with their bodies arranged exactly as he had described, she understood that the detail mattered now. She went inside. She began moving everything she had not already stored into the cellar. She worked with the focused urgency of someone who understands that the time available is shorter than it looks, and she did not stop until every last jar, every sack, every crock was below ground, and the trap door latched above it. In Promise 2 miles east, the summer wound down in its ordinary rhythms. The wheat harvest was underway. The general store had full shelves. Harlan Aldrich had ridden out twice in August to inspect the Abernathy property from the county road, assessing it with the detached eye of a man who owns things he has not worked. He had seen nothing to trouble him. He did not come close enough to see the repaired roof, the sealed walls, The careful absence of any sign that someone was living and working and building something that would outlast him. The town of Promise had reached its conclusion about Idella Voss. She was 18 years old alone without resources in a dry Kansas August. Her mother had gone to relatives in Ellsworth. The girl herself had disappeared into the geography of a county large enough to absorb the quietly desperate without anyone needing to account for them. Harriet Farwell said a prayer for her at the Tuesday Circle and moved on to the next subject. The prayer was sincere. The moving on was also sincere. Both things can be true. They did not know about the cellar. They did not know about the 64 jars on the shelves, the candle flame bending in the ventilation draft, the thermometer reading 56 degrees against the August heat, or the girl sitting on a crate in the underground cool, running her fingers along the timberwork, learning with her hands what a dead man had tried to give her with words. The grasshoppers outside numbered in the dozens that evening. By the following morning, hundreds, their sound-changing individual clicking, giving way to something continuous, something that was less a collection of insects and more a single sustained pressure against the air. Her grandfather had described that sound too. He had said you will know it because you will feel it before you hear it. She latched the barn doors from inside, went down into the cellar, sat on the crate with her palms flat on the cool stone floor, and waited for whatever the sky had decided to deliver next. The morning of September 3rd began still and white, with a sky the color of bleached cotton, and an air so quiet the barn felt sealed from everything beyond its walls. Idella had not slept well. She had lain in the loft through the small hours listening to the grasshoppers. Their sound had changed again sometime after midnight, shifting from the continuous pressure she had noted the previous evening into something she could only describe as singular. One sustained tone, not a collection of insects, but a single note. The way a church organ fills a room until the room itself seems to be producing the sound rather than merely containing it. She was eating her small breakfast when she felt it first. Not heard, felt. A vibration below the threshold of hearing, registered in the back teeth, in the sternum, in the soles of her feet against the loft floor. Then sound arrived from the southwest, a low roar that did not belong to weather or wind or any category of ordinary noise she had words for. Not thunder, not freight, something older than either. She walked to the gap in the barn wall and looked west. The sky was moving, not clouds, something brown and dense that rose from the horizon line and spread sideways as it came, dimming the sun to a pale orange disk. Behind the thickness of it, casting an amber light over the fields that made everything look suspended, preserved, seen through old glass. The wheat still standing in the surrounding fields turned the color of something already past saving. The air in front of the barn thickened. Then the sound became something that pressed against her ears with physical weight, and the thickening resolved into bodies, thousands of them, then hundreds of thousands, then a number beyond counting. They arrived as weather, as a biological atmosphere that replaced the ordinary air with something that clicked and tore and consumed. The ground was covered within seconds. The barn walls were covered. The fence posts, the dried creek bed, the scrub grass, the cottonwood trees along the fence line, every available surface received them with a density that seemed to violate some principle of how much space a thing could occupy. The sound of feeding began within the first minute, a collective sharp rasping she could only describe as the sound of the world being erased at its surface methodically, without malice, without pause. She did not run. She did not call out for anyone because there was no one to call. She walked to the trap door, lifted, it went down the stairs, pulled it shut over her head, and set the iron latch. The cellar was dark except for the candle she lit from the shelf box. She sat on the overturned crate at the bottom of the steps, placed her palms flat on the stone floor, felt the vibration of what was happening above her transmitted through the earth into her hands, a faint rhythmic trembling, almost like a pulse, almost like the earth itself was registering the event. The candle flame stood perfectly straight. The air moved in its slow, continuous circuit through the pipes, cool, clean, entirely indifferent to the catastrophe taking place 12 feet above her head. She checked the thermometer, 56 degrees. She checked each jar on the shelf nearest her, pressing the lids with her thumb. Every seal held. She checked the sacks for any sign of moisture or intrusion. Nothing. The cellar was intact in every particular, functioning exactly as her grandfather had said it would function, in exactly the conditions he had described when she was 15 years old and not yet ready to understand why it mattered. She stayed through the rest of that day and all of the next, sleeping in short intervals on the crate, with her coat folded under her head, waking to check the thermometer and the ventilation in the jars, then sleeping again. The sound above her changed over the hours. The rasping feeding sound gave way to a different note, something more dispersed, as though the swarm was beginning to move on. By the evening of the fourth, the vibration in the floor had diminished. By the morning of the fifth, it was gone. When she lifted the trap door on the morning of September 5th, the silence reached her before the light did. Not the ordinary silence of early morning, which has texture and movement in it, birdsong, wind, the distant sounds of a county beginning its day. This was something with a different quality entirely. The silence of subtraction, a world from which something essential had been removed and had not yet been replaced. She climbed out and stood on the main floor of the barn and looked through the gaps in the wall at what remained of the landscape. The fields were gone, not damaged or thinned gone. The wheat stubble that remained was pale and chewed to within an inch of the soil. The grass along the creek had been stripped to bare earth, the cracked mud margins now extending all the way to the bank. The cottonwood trees along the fence line stood with bare branches in the September heat, like something from the wrong season, a winter imposed without cold, without the ordinary preparations that make winter bearable. The kitchen garden she could see behind the Garner farmhouse 2 miles east was stems and nothing else. The kitchen garden that Vera Garner had worked through the spring and summer, that her children had been sent to weed on Saturday mornings, that represented several months of careful supplementary food stems. She stood in the barn doorway for a long time and let herself look at it without flinching, without reaching for a mitigating thought. The county had been eaten, not metaphorically, literally eaten. She had been below ground when it happened and had felt it through the stone floor as a pulse, and now she was above ground looking at what the pulse had left behind. Then she went down into the cellar and lit the candle and checked the thermometer. 56 degrees. She checked the shelves, every jar intact, the sacks untouched, the salt pork sitting undisturbed in its crock. She held the candle near the low pipe and watched the flame bend toward it, the same gentle pull it had made the first day she tested it in August. Steady, unhurried. The system did not know what had happened above it. The earth did not know. It kept what it had been given with a fidelity the sky had never managed, and would never manage because the sky was not built for keeping. She sat on the crate in the underground cool for a while and thought about her grandfather going underground at 15 in a Pennsylvania coal mine. About the particular kind of knowledge that comes from learning a place by surviving it, not visiting it, not studying it, but being present in it through conditions that were genuinely dangerous day after day for years. He had learned what the earth held and how it held it, and how to work with that holding rather than against it. And he had tried to give that learning to a granddaughter who was not yet ready to receive it. He had given it anyway. "You built good, Grandpa Harmon," she said into the cellar air. "Better than you knew." In promise, the silence that followed the swarm was of a different kind. It was the silence of people doing arithmetic they did not want to complete. Idella heard about it in pieces over the following days, as the picture assembled itself from the fragments that came to her first from Vera Garner, who came to the barn 3 days after the swarm passed with her youngest child on her hip, and a look on her face that was new. Not the practical, capable expression Idella had come to know from their canning work together. Something that had cracked open underneath it. Something that had been held in place by the ordinary momentum of a functional life and was now exposed because the momentum had stopped and there was nothing left to hold it. Vera sat at the small table on the main floor of the barn and told her about the harvest. What had been cut and stored before September 3rd was safe. What had still been standing in the fields when the swarm arrived was gone, without exception, not damaged, not partially salvaged, gone. Lester Pruitt, who had been cutting his last section on the afternoon of the 2nd, had lost perhaps a third of his year's yield. The Calloway family north of town, who had been waiting for the grain to dry a few more days before cutting, had lost nearly everything they had left standing. She told Idella about the kitchen garden, her family's supplemental food supply through winter, the beans and beets and turnips, and the last of the summer squash. She told her that Philip had been sitting on the porch in the evening saying very little, running the arithmetic that did not come out right, no matter how many times you attempted it. She told her that her children were asking questions. She did not know how to answer the specific questions that children ask when the adults around them have gone quiet in a new way. Idella listened to all of it. She gave Vera 4 jars from the cellar, 2 of preserved tomatoes, 2 of pickled beans. "Come back in 2 weeks," she told her. Vera looked at her when she said that, with something new in her expression, the beginning of a question that had not yet found its words. Idella did not wait for it. The winter was coming, and with it the full weight of what the grasshoppers had taken. And she had work to do before any of the questions that were forming in the community of promise would have answers worth giving. The weeks after the swarm were a slow unwinding, the way a crisis always reveals itself, not in the initial blow, but in the weeks of reckoning that follow. The grasshoppers had eaten and moved on. What remained was the arithmetic of their passage, and that arithmetic was being done in every farmhouse in Holt County with results that did not comfort. The shelves at the general store in Promise began showing gaps by the middle of September. What goods remained were repriced upward by a storekeeper who understood supply and demand and was not unsympathetic, but also had a family of his own to consider, a man doing a legal thing, which was becoming the refrain of that autumn. A barrel of cornmeal that had cost 40 cents in August cost 60 cents in September and 70 cents in October. Flour was rationed by the second week of October. Salt pork could be had at a price that assumed a prosperity the community no longer possessed. Harriet Farwell organized prayer meetings on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She was a capable woman, and the community benefited from the structure she provided. The meeting times gave shape to evenings that might otherwise dissolve into private worry, and the shared presence of people in a difficult situation is itself a kind of resource. But Idella had absorbed something from her grandfather about the relationship between faith and practicality, not that they competed with each other, but that they did not substitute for each other either. Prayer sustained the spirit through a cold night. Stored food kept the body alive until morning. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone, and confusing them for each other was its own kind of disaster. She moved her sleeping quarters from the loft fully into the barn's main floor in the first week of October. The soapstone she had traded for back in August went into the corner on a flat stone base, and she began rationing her woodpile with the precision of someone who has done the calculation twice and found the margin tight both times. 3 pounds of wood each night against a projected winter of 5 months. The number was tight, but it held, and she had decided that a tight number held to was better than a generous number abandoned. Her meals were a discipline: a cup of boiled beans at midday, a small piece of salt pork in the evening, a spoonful of preserved plums when the cold made the evening meal feel insufficient. She ate the same quantities every day regardless of hunger. The schedule was the thing, not the feeling. Her grandfather had explained this once at the kitchen table in the plainest possible terms. You do not eat when you are hungry on a ration. You eat on the schedule. Hunger is an opinion. The food stores are a fact. Run the facts, not the opinions. She descended into the cellar every other morning, and the routine had a quality she had not anticipated, something close to meditation, though she would not have used that word. The lifting of the trap door, the cool air rising around her before she reached the stairs, the particular underground steadiness that the world above could not touch, regardless of what the world above was doing. She checked each shelf by candlelight, pressing jar lids for signs of seal failure, checking sacks for softness that might indicate rot beginning. She checked the thermometer, 56 degrees through October and into November, 57 in the first week of December, when the cold above was so extreme that even the deep earth conceded a single degree, the first and only concession it made all winter. Philip Garner came to the barn on a Tuesday in the second week of October. He came alone, without Vera, carrying a piece of brown paper on which he had sketched the layout of his farm with the careful hand of a man who thinks visually. He had questions about soil composition and pipe placement and the specific dimensions of the timber cuts. He asked them with the patience of a man who intended to hear every word before responding, who had decided before arriving that he was going to understand this correctly or not at all. She answered as precisely as she could, pointing to the measurements her grandfather had used, and explaining the principle behind each one. The reason for 8 feet of depth rather than 6. The logic of the notch and why a straight plank failed where a notched one held the function of each pipe, and why both were necessary, and why the placement of each relative to the other was not arbitrary. She showed him the candle test. She let him descend the stairs himself and stand on the stone floor and feel the temperature difference with his own body, because she had learned by then that there was a difference between being told a thing and feeling it, and that the feeling was the part that stayed. He stood at the bottom of the stairs for a long moment with his hand against the shoring timber pressing. Nothing moved. He looked at the thermometer on the nail. He looked at the shelves of jars in the candlelight. He came back up the stairs without speaking, and when he reached the main floor, he sat down at the table and looked at her with an expression that had settled into something resolution, she thought, or the particular calm of a man who has found the answer to a question that has been worrying him. He came back 2 days later with Elbert Crane, a farmer north of town who had been working his land for 20 years and had the particular authority that comes from 2 decades of surviving Kansas. Crane listened to everything she said with his arms crossed and his eyes on the cellar floor. And when she finished explaining the ventilation system, he descended the stairs himself and stood at the bottom and pressed his hand against the shoring timber, the way her grandfather had pressed his hand against the wall in the root cellar on the Voss farm, and he nodded once to himself, not to her. "You built this yourself," Crane said when he came back up. "Not a question. Starting in late June," she told him. He looked at her for a moment with the assessing look of a man recalculating something. Then he nodded again and said nothing further, which from Elbert Crane was its own form of acknowledgement. The word moved through promise the way genuine information moved in a community under pressure. Not as gossip, which travels fast and changes with each telling, but as something more like current, directional, purposeful. Philip Garner was not a man given to embellishment, and what he said about the barn and the cellar and the temperature and the system of pipes he said in the factual language of someone describing a reliable piece of farm equipment. He said the terms were fair. He said Idella Voss was keeping a ledger. Within a week others came. A widow named Greta Hollis arrived one morning with 2 daughters, girls of perhaps 12 and 9, and stood at the barn door with the careful posture of a woman who has rehearsed maintaining her dignity in circumstances that make it difficult. She offered her skill at mending and quilting in exchange for flour and dried beans, and she named the quantities she needed with the precision of someone who had done the arithmetic and was not asking for more than the arithmetic required. Idella wrote her name in the ledger, wrote the terms, turned it to show her. Greta Hollis read it and signed it with a steadiness that said she had been signing her name to things that required steadiness for a long time. Cyrus Brand, the blacksmith from town whose forge had been cold since October, for lack of customers with the means to pay, came the following week. He was a large man who moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to working around hot metal, and he had the look of a man who has been idle against his nature for too long. He offered to repair tools and fabricate new hardware in exchange for enough food to see his family through January. She looked at the tools she had been working with all summer. The spade handle that had cracked and been wrapped with rope, the hatchet head that needed resetting, the hand saw that had begun to pull left. She accepted. A farmer named Willis, the same one she had traded fence mending with in August, came with his wife. A woman named Augusta, who did most of the talking and negotiated with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. They offered 3 weeks of labor in the spring, plowing, planting whatever was needed in exchange for stores to carry them through January and February. Idella considered the offer carefully, counted the jars on the shelf against the names already in the ledger, did the arithmetic twice, and accepted. Each person she received at the barn door she listened to carefully, assessed the offer and the need and the fairness of what was proposed, wrote the terms in the ledger in the hand her grandfather had taught her. Steady, small, precise. She was not dispensing mercy. That distinction mattered, and she held it clearly. Mercy is given freely without accounting. What she was doing was organizing survival according to principles that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the honest assessment of what people had to give and what they needed in return. The ledger was not a record of charity. It was a record of what a community could produce for itself when someone was willing to hold the terms to a standard that asked something real of everyone and protected everyone at the same time. She was 18 years old, keeping accounts for adults who were in some cases 40 years her senior. None of them challenged the fairness of the terms. Fairness is recognized even when it is inconvenient to acknowledge, even when the recognition requires sitting across a table from a girl young enough to be your granddaughter and signing your name to her document. The Garner family slaughtered their milk cow in the second week of November because the cost of feeding her through winter exceeded what the family could bear. The cow had a name. Idella heard this from Vera, who said it plainly without dramatizing, but whose voice had a particular flatness when she said the name that told you what the flatness was covering. The children had cried. Then the beef had fed the family through the end of November, and when it was gone, there was nothing to replace it. The Schmidt boy, 12 years old, the one who used to race his dog along the fence line on summer evenings, whose dog had been a fixture at the edge of every community gathering. Idella could remember took fever in the first week of December and did not recover. His death moved through the community the way a young death moves, with a particular velocity, touching each family with the cold knowledge that the margin was thinner than anyone had been willing to say aloud before. Now they knew. The knowing changed the way people spoke to each other in the weeks after, quieter, more deliberate, as though words had joined the list of things to be rationed. Harriet Farwell came to the barn the week after the Schmidt boy died. She came without the prepared expression of sympathy she wore in most of her community interactions. Something in the circumstances had stripped that away, or perhaps she had simply decided it was not appropriate here. She sat at Idella's table and asked direct questions about the cellar and the ventilation system and the food stores, the kind of questions that said she had been thinking about this before she arrived and had made a list. Idella answered them all. When Harriet left, she paused at the barn door and turned back. "You are doing a good thing here," Harriet said. Her voice had the quality of a woman saying something she has decided to say rather than something she says habitually. "I want you to know I see it." Idella considered this. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Tell anyone who needs to come." Harriet nodded and went out into the December cold, and Idella watched her walk back toward the county road and thought about what it cost a woman like Harriet Farwell to come to a barn on the edge of an abandoned property to tell an 18-year-old girl that she was doing a good thing. It had cost something. She appreciated that Harriet had paid it anyway. One evening in the second week of December, Idella sat beside the soapstone after the day's work was done and held her grandfather's gloves in her hands for a while before putting them on. Worn through at the left thumb, dark with decades of oil and earth. She had been saving them without quite articulating why had been using her own gloves for the daily work and keeping his folded near her sleeping place, taking them out occasionally to look at them. She pressed her face briefly into the worn leather before pulling them on. They still carried something, not the mine dust exactly, more the memory of it, the specific smell of a man who had worked underground for 35 years and had never quite washed it entirely away despite years of trying. She held them against her face for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of his absence, which she had been managing carefully all autumn, measuring it out in small amounts so it would not overwhelm the work. She put the gloves on and went back to the evening's tasks. She did not know yet how much she would need them. The temperature had been dropping for 3 consecutive days in a way that felt deliberate, each morning colder than the last, in a progression that had the quality of argument being made. The cold making a point, refusing to relent. By the evening of the 14th of December, the thermometer on the barn wall read 19 below zero. The wind from the northwest was sustained and hard, pushing fine snow through every gap in the walls she had not found and sealed, finding new ones she had not known existed, filling the spaces between boards with a white line that was almost beautiful in the lantern light and completely beside the point. She was in her corner of the main floor with the soapstone burning and her grandfather's gloves on her hands when she smelled it. Moisture. Not the ordinary damp of a winter barn, something closer and organic, a heaviness in the air that did not belong to wood or hay or the cold itself. She sat still for a moment, identifying it the way her grandfather had taught her to identify anything unfamiliar. Stop, breathe, name it before you move, because the name tells you what action is required. Then she knew. The upper ventilation pipe was blocked. She went to the trapdoor and lifted it. The smell was stronger below, the faint beginning of something going wrong in still air, the early note of a process that would become serious quickly if it was not interrupted. She understood immediately what was happening. When the upper pipe blocked, the warm, moist air produced by the stored food had nowhere to go. It collected against the jar lids, against the wooden shelves. Condensation began. Condensation in the right conditions became mold. Mold in a root cellar spread with a thoroughness that could destroy months of preserved food in days, not weeks, days, and it spread from the damp surfaces outward to the dry ones with the indiscriminate efficiency of something that does not care what it costs you. The upper pipe vented through the barn wall below the eaves on the northeast corner. To reach it, she would need to climb the exterior wall in 19 below zero in a sustained northwest wind. She stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs and made herself assess this with clarity rather than feeling. The feeling was available, she was aware of it as a pressure at the edges of her thinking, but she set it aside in favor of the plain inventory of what the situation required. She had one alternative to climbing, which was to do nothing and lose the cellar's contents over the next week or 10 days. That was not an alternative. It was a way of framing the absence of alternatives. She put on every piece of clothing she owned in layers. 2 wool undershirts, the heavy wool dress, the flannel overskirt, her grandfather's wool coat that still carried very faintly beneath decades of washing the smell of the Pennsylvania mine, the particular mineral darkness that had been his working atmosphere for 35 years and had never entirely left the fabric, the oilskin over that, the gloves already on her hands, the scarf wrapped twice around her face, leaving only her eyes uncovered. She tied a length of rope to the main support beam inside the barn and paid it out through the small access door at the base of the east wall, then went outside with the rope in one hand and the screwdriver in her coat pocket. The cold at 19 below zero was not a temperature. It was a medium something with physical presence and intent, something that pressed against every exposed surface with an immediacy that was genuinely frightening rather than merely uncomfortable. Her eyes watered the moment she stepped outside. The moisture froze on her lashes within seconds, thickening them, narrowing her vision. She kept her face turned slightly from the direct wind and found the barn wall with both hands and began to climb, using the protruding ends of the horizontal boards as footholds, testing each one before committing weight. The pipe opening was buried under ice nearly 2 inches thick, formed around a blockage of packed snow in the bore. She worked at it with the screwdriver chipping with the deliberate economy of someone who understood that the hands inside the gloves had a limited working time before they stopped receiving instructions correctly, before the messages traveling between her intent and her fingers began arriving with a delay that would make the fine work impossible. The wind pulled at her continuously. She did not look down. She did not look at the horizon or the sky or the county road below her or any of the things available to look at if she permitted herself to be distracted by them. She looked at the ice and she chipped at the ice, and she felt her hands beginning to slow, and she kept chipping. The ice broke in a single piece, not gradually, but all at once, the way certain held things release. The packed snow behind it dropped free, fell onto her shoulder, and she felt the pipe shudder faintly as pressure equalized inside it, felt before she heard the small movement of air resuming its circuit through the system. She held the bare skin of her inner wrist against the pipe opening for 3 seconds, felt the faint warmth of exhaust air against her pulse point. The system was breathing again. Her hands had stopped responding to instruction with their usual reliability. She knew this without panic. She had noted the delay in the last minutes of chipping and had accounted for it. She used the rope to lower herself the last 4 feet rather than trusting her grip to the boards, and she went inside and stood in the dark of the barn and breathed slowly and waited for the cold to release her hands back to her. It took longer than she would have liked. She stood and breathed and waited and did not rush it, because rushing the return of sensation in cold-damaged hands was how you made errors in the assessment of your own condition. When her hands were fully responsive, she went down into the cellar. The condensation bloom on the jar lids nearest the ceiling was already beginning to clear as circulation resumed. She checked each shelf. Nothing was lost. Nothing had progressed far enough to be lost. She had gotten there in time because she had smelled it in time, because she had been paying the kind of attention her grandfather had spent 35 years underground learning to pay. She held the candle near the low pipe. The flame bent toward it, steady, unhurried, the same gentle pull it had made in August. She sat on the crate in the complete underground dark after she blew the candle out, and she listened to the faint movement of air through the 2 pipes. In, out. The slow, continuous breath of the system doing exactly what it had been designed to do, because a man who understood the earth had designed it correctly, and a girl who had finally understood his design had built it with her own hands. She climbed back up and sealed the trapdoor and went to bed. January arrived with the deliberate purpose of a Kansas January that has committed fully to its intentions. The temperature stayed below zero for 11 consecutive days. The snow from earlier storms had compressed under its own weight, and the wind had carved it into shapes that looked permanent. The county road was indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape for days at a time. Promise was cut off from the rail line at Ellsworth for more than a week. No supplies in, no word out. The community folded into itself by the weather and left to manage on what it had. The families in Idella's ledger were surviving. Thin cold eating simply, but with food, and with the particular steadiness that comes from having terms you understand, and supplies you can count on from knowing the floor and finding it holds. The families outside the ledger were enduring a different kind of winter. She thought often during those 11 days about Harlan Aldrich. He had not come to the barn. She had anticipated this. Aldrich was a man whose entire architecture of self required that he be the one, with leverage, the one whose terms others accepted, the one who held the paper. He was 50 years old, and he had built himself around that position for decades, and coming to a girl he had dispossessed in June, in a barn on land he still considered effectively his. To ask for anything at all, this was a cost. His particular kind of pride was not yet willing to pay. Her grandfather had explained men like Aldrich once at the kitchen table in the months before he died, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything important. He said a man who has built his sense of himself entirely around the possession of leverage over others will do almost anything. Before he gives it up, will exhaust every other option, accept conditions that would be intolerable in other circumstances. Wait longer than is wise. The worst thing you can do to such a man, her grandfather said, is remove all his alternatives one by one until the only one remaining is to come to you honestly. Then he will come. Winter, Idella thought, would do the removing. She waited. The soapstone ticked in the corner as it cooled each night, and she added her 3 pounds of wood, and it ticked again as it warmed. The names in the ledger accumulated. The jar count on the shelves decreased in the measured amounts she had projected in October, tracking within 2% of her calculation. The earth below her held at 56 degrees against everything the sky was doing above, held it with the patient fidelity of something that has never been required to hurry, that keeps not because it decides to keep, but because keeping is what it is. She was not comfortable. She wanted to be precise about that in her own accounting because there was a version of this story where the winter became something noble in memory, and she did not want to tell herself that version. She was cold in the mornings, before the soapstone had taken the overnight chill from the barn. Her hands were often numb at the first task of each day. The monotony of the ration, the same cup of beans, the same piece of salt pork, the same spoonful of plums was genuine and grinding, in the way that repetition over months becomes not boring, but physically wearing, as though the sameness itself takes a toll. But the stores were intact. The terms in the ledger were being honored on both sides. The community was not dying. It was enduring, which is a different thing, and in some ways a harder one because endurance has no clear endpoint. It simply continues until conditions change, and then it continues differently. The conditions began changing in the 3rd week of January. Not the temperature that held, but something in the quality of the silences when people sat at her table. A loosening, a sense that the worst had been calculated and found survivable, that the floor had been located and was holding. She was wrong about one thing. She had expected Aldrich to wait until February, when the rail line had resumed and he would have at least one alternative available to him before he came. She was wrong by several weeks. The Garner children came to the barn for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, arriving with their mother and standing in the doorway with the particular stillness of children who have been told to behave and have decided to take the instructions seriously. There were 3 of them, a boy of perhaps 10, a girl of 8, and the youngest, a girl of 5 who held Vera's hand and studied Idella with the frank, undefended curiosity that children have before the world teaches them that looking directly at things is rude. Vera had come to settle the terms of her second exchange, and she brought the children because Philip was in the field, and there was nowhere else for them to be. Idella showed the older 2 the cellar, while Vera held the youngest on her hip. The boy, his name was Caleb, stood at the bottom of the stairs with his hands in his pockets and looked at the shelves of jars in the candlelight with an expression she recognized. It was the expression she had worn at 15, standing in her grandfather's root cellar looking at the same arrangement of preserved food and timber and pipe. The expression of someone receiving information that has not yet found its context. She told him about the temperature. She lit a candle and showed him the flame bending toward the low pipe. He watched the flame with a focused attention that reminded her of her grandfather, the quality of someone who is genuinely watching rather than merely looking. "Why does it bend?" he asked. She told him about warm air rising and cool air entering to replace it, about the pressure differential between the two pipe openings, about the way a system in equilibrium will maintain itself without any additional intervention as long as the pipes remain clear. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "And your grandfather taught you this," he said. "His grandfather taught him," she said. "In 35 years of coal mining, I only had one summer." Caleb looked at the shelves again. The 8-year-old, whose name was Ruth, had been examining the jars one by one, reading the labels their mother had written in careful script. Beans, tomatoes, plums, beets, with the methodical thoroughness of a child who has decided that if she is going to look at something, she will look at all of it. "Mama puts up jars too," Ruth said. "We had 60 before." Vera's voice came from the top of the stairs. "Ruth, that's enough." "It's all right," Idella said. She looked at Ruth. 60 is a good number. What happened to them?" Ruth looked at her mother at the top of the stairs, then back at Idella. "The grasshoppers got into the storage shed," she said. "The ones on the shelf in the kitchen are safe. There are 11. 11, Idella said. She kept her voice even. She gave Vera 8 jars when they left, more than the terms of the exchange required, and Vera noticed. Idella wrote it in the ledger as a credit against future labor rather than charity, which was a distinction that mattered to her, and she believed mattered to Vera as well, and Vera accepted it without comment, which confirmed the belief. After they left, she sat at the table for a while and thought about 11 jars and 5 months of winter and 3 children, and did some arithmetic that did not require paper. The community's relationship with the ledger shifted in November in a way she had not anticipated. When the first people had come in October, they had arrived individually or in pairs, each one carrying their particular situation and their particular proposal, each negotiation conducted privately. By November, people were coming in groups, not because they had organized themselves, but because word of who was coming and when had moved through the community, and people had begun timing their visits to coincide with others. 2 families would arrive within an hour of each other and would sit at the table together and conduct their business side by side, aware of what the other was offering and receiving. At first, she had worried this would create problems, that people would compare terms and find inequities that required explanation. What happened instead was something she had not predicted. The transparency seemed to help. People could see that the widow Greta Hollis, who had nothing to offer but quilting skill, received the same measure per unit of labor as Philip Garner, who was offering carpentry. The standard held regardless of who was in the room. Seeing this, people stopped worrying about whether they were being treated fairly and started thinking about what else they had to offer. A man named Dodd, who had come in October with nothing to offer and had gone away without entering the ledger, came back in November with a different accounting of his capacities. He had been a school teacher before he came to Kansas, he said, and he could teach the Garner children and the Hollis girls through the winter months, and the Crane children and any others whose families were in the ledger, in exchange for a share of stores. He said he had thought about it for a month before coming back, and he wanted to be clear that he was not offering charity, but a service he was genuinely qualified to provide. She wrote his name in the ledger. She wrote the terms: 2 afternoons of teaching per week, covering reading and arithmetic, and whatever else seemed useful, in exchange for a measured weekly supply of flour and dried beans. She turned it for him to read. He read it carefully, the way people read things they intend to honor and sign. The following week, Augusta Willis came back, the farmer's wife, who had negotiated with such focused attention in October, and proposed an amendment to her family's existing terms. Her husband was a capable carpenter as well as a farmer, she said, and there was specific work the barn needed that her husband could do now rather than waiting until spring. She proposed replacing the spring labor with an equivalent amount of winter carpentry work. Given that winter labor was available and spring labor was uncertain, Idella considered this. The barn's east wall had gaps that let in wind she had not been able to fully seal with clay and rags. The tack room door had been broken since she arrived, and the constant swinging was wearing the hinge. There were boards on the main floor that had softened and would eventually give way. She accepted the amendment. She crossed out the original terms in the ledger and wrote the new ones alongside, noting the date of the change. Willis came the next day and spent 3 days on the repairs, working with the efficiency of a man who knows his materials. And when he was done, the barn was noticeably warmer and noticeably quieter, and the tack room door stayed where it was put. She watched the ledger accumulate and thought about what her grandfather had said about keeping honest books. The most important thing he had told her was to apply the same standard to everyone, regardless of how you felt about them. The second most important thing was never to extend more credit than the other party could reasonably repay, because debt that cannot be repaid destroys people, and the destruction is not the debtor's fault alone. He had kept accounts his whole life with the miners he worked beside in Pennsylvania, with the farmers who were his neighbors in Kansas, with the merchants in Ellsworth who supplied him. He had applied the same standard to everyone and expected the same honesty in return. She had thought she understood him to mean a technical thing, that accurate records prevented disputes. She understood now that he had meant something larger. To account for a person's contribution honestly was to take that person seriously. To be taken seriously was something people needed as much as food. The ledger was not just a record of transactions. It was a record of what each person in it had to give, stated plainly and held to a standard that said the giving mattered, and the terms were real, and the person on the other side of the table was a capable party to a genuine exchange and not a case to be managed. This was why people carried themselves differently when they left than when they arrived. Philip Garner had come with the careful posture of a man who has rehearsed maintaining his dignity in circumstances that make it difficult. He left having made a transaction, having given labor for food, having signed his name to terms he had proposed himself, having been met with the same standard that met everyone else. He was not in debt to anyone's generosity. He was in a fair exchange with someone who kept honest books. The rehearsed dignity was gone because the circumstances that required it were gone. Greta Hollis had arrived with the particular practiced quietness of a widow who has learned to take up as little space as possible in a world that has already contracted around her. She left having negotiated terms for her quilting skill, terms she had proposed that she had read carefully and signed. She walked back toward town with her daughters beside her and her head at a different angle than it had been when she came. Idella noticed these things and filed them alongside the technical knowledge her grandfather had given her in the category of things that were worth knowing and worth passing on. The cold deepened through November and into December in the gradual, relentless way of a Kansas winter that has decided it is going to make its point fully. The creek froze solid in the last week of November. The county road became difficult by the first week of December, not impassable, but requiring a particular attention and a willingness to commit to the ruts rather than fighting them. The visits to the barn slowed as the weather worsened, which was expected, and the terms already established in the ledger carried the relationships through the gaps. She heard about the wider county in pieces, the way you hear about a large thing when you are at one point of it, and the information travels slowly and unevenly. The news was not good. Families north of Promise who had no root cellars and no ledger and no particular plan had begun the winter with less than they needed and were discovering in December what that meant in practice. A family named Breckett, she did not know them. They farmed 8 miles north, had sent their older children to relatives in Ellsworth rather than feed them through the winter on what remained. The children would come back in spring. The parents stayed with the land because leaving the land meant losing the land, and losing the land meant there was no spring to come back to. She thought about this. She thought about the arithmetic of it, the calculation a family made when the variables were children and land and winter and what remained of the food supply. She thought about the fact that her grandfather's knowledge, if it had been more widely distributed before September, might have changed some of those calculations. Not all of them. Some. The thought sat with her through December in the way that certain thoughts sit with you when there is nothing to be done about them immediately, but they are not willing to wait. Cyrus Brand, the blacksmith, came to the barn on a Thursday in the second week of December to deliver the hardware he had fabricated for the barn doors. Hinges, a new latch assembly for the main doors, replacement hardware for the tack room. He installed it himself in the space of a morning, working with the focused competence of a man returned to his proper element after too long away from it. And when he was done, he stood back and looked at the doors and at the hinges and at the latch assembly with the expression of someone who has done a thing correctly and knows it. He told her while he was packing his tools that his forge was running again. Not at full capacity, the demand was not there yet for full capacity, but running. He had a commission to repair a neighbor's plow, and word had gotten out that the forge was operating, and two other commissions had come in since. Small things, enough to keep the fire burning and to justify keeping it burning. You started that, he said. He was looking at his tools as he said it, not at her. I didn't start anything, she told him. You had the skill, you had the forge. You needed a reason to keep going and a way to get through until the reason arrived. He considered this. He did not agree or disagree with it. He picked up his tool bag and walked out into the December cold, and she watched him go and thought that this was probably the most honest account of what the ledger had done, not created anything that was not already there, but provided a structure in which what was already there could be exchanged at a standard that preserved the dignity of everyone involved in the exchange. The temperature dropped to 19 below on the evening of the 14th, and she smelled the moisture in the air and knew what it meant. And she put on her grandfather's coat and his gloves and went outside into the darkness and climbed the barn wall with a screwdriver in her pocket and cleared the block pipe in the cold. That was not a temperature, but a medium, a presence, something with intent. Her hands stopped responding correctly somewhere around the 5th minute of chipping. She kept chipping. The ice broke. The air moved again. She came down on the rope and stood in the barn in the dark until her hands returned to her. She went down into the cellar, and the condensation was already clearing, and nothing was lost, and the candle flame bent toward the low pipe steady and unhurried, and she sat in the complete underground dark for a while and listened to the pipes breathe. That night, lying on her sleeping place on the main floor of the barn, with the soapstone ticking as it cooled, she thought about what her grandfather had said about the two pipes. He had been very specific about why both were necessary, not just the low intake pipe, but the high exhaust pipe, and why the differential in their placement was what drove the circulation. She had understood it abstractly when he explained it. She understood it now in the specific, visceral way that you understand something. You have nearly lost understood it in her hands, in the memory of the cold, in the screwdriver, in the ice breaking, in the pipe shuddering back to life. The specifications were the floor. This was something she had been thinking about since the east wall collapsed in the rain in June, the difference between the specifications and the principles behind them. The specifications told you what to build. 8 feet deep, notched shoring locked into horizontal plates. 2 pipes, one low and one high. These were the floor, and they were not negotiable if you wanted the outcome they produced. But the floor alone was insufficient. The floor without the principles beneath it was a skill that would fail. The moment conditions changed would fail exactly as her straight plank shoring had failed in the first hard rain, because she had the shape of the method without the reason for the shape. The principles were the ceiling. They were what allowed you to adapt when the conditions demanded adaptation, to understand why the notch mattered so that you could apply the notch correctly in soil, different from the soil your grandfather had taught you in a barn different from the barn on the Voss farm, in circumstances he had never anticipated. When Elbert Crane had come with his modification for his particular clay composition, the principles were what she had used to assess whether the modification would hold, whether it preserved the outcomes the original specifications were designed to produce. It had. She had been able to tell him that it had and why, because she had the ceiling. Her grandfather had tried to give her both the floor and the ceiling. He had given her the floor explicitly, the measurements, the dimensions, the specific cuts. He had given her the ceiling through explanation why each measurement was what it was, what principle each specification was in service of. She had received the floor more readily than the ceiling, because floors are concrete and ceilings require the kind of thinking that only becomes possible after you have failed at the application. The ceiling had become available to her in the dark, at the bottom of the collapsed hole, with the rain on her shoulders, and the ruined timber around her, and the full weight of what she had not understood pressing down on her with a clarity that only failure produces. She had been trying since then to give both to the people who came to her table. The floor, first the measurements, the pipe placement, the timber cuts, the candle test. Then the ceiling, the reason for the depth, the logic of the notch, the principle of the differential that drove the ventilation. She was a better teacher than her grandfather in one specific sense, which was that she knew which part the listener was most likely to receive carelessly, because she had been exactly that listener. She took particular care with the notch. She took particular care with the two pipes. She made sure anyone who left her table understanding the specifications also left understanding why the specifications were what they were. She thought, lying in the dark with the soapstone cooling beside her and the January cold pressing against the barn walls, that this was probably the most important thing her grandfather had given her. Not the root cellar, not the specifications, not the two pipes. The habit of thinking about why. The refusal to accept that knowing what was sufficient. The insistence that knowing why was what made the what reliable under conditions no one had planned for. He had spent 35 years underground learning to ask why. The earth had answered him in the language of pressure and temperature, and the way damp moved through stone, and he had listened because in a mine shaft, the answers to why were often what stood between a man and a cave-in. He had brought that habit of questioning out of the mine with him and applied it to farming and to root cellars and to the evenings at the kitchen table when he sat across from a granddaughter who was not fully listening and gave her anyway everything he knew, trusting that the why would find her when she needed it. It had found her in a collapsed hole in the rain in June. She thought it would find Caleb Garner someday too, standing at the bottom of some failed thing in some circumstances neither of them could currently anticipate. The boy had watched the candle flame with the right quality of attention. He would be all right. January held. The county road remained difficult. The rail line stayed cut off. The stores in the Ledger family's households remained above the level that would have required emergency decisions, though not by margins anyone found comfortable. The barn was warmer now with Willis's carpentry work and the sealed walls and the soapstone burning its measured 3 pounds of wood each night. She had adjusted the wood ration by a quarter-pound upward in the second week of January when it became clear that the winter was going to be harder than her October projection had accounted for. The adjustment was within the reserve she had built into the calculation. The reserve held. She thought about Harlan Aldrich. She thought about the arithmetic he was doing wherever he was doing it, in the bank, in Promise, or in his house on the Good Street east of the general store. The house with the wood siding painted white that she had walked past 100 times without thinking about who lived in it or what their winter looked like. She thought about his wife, whose name she did not know, whom she had never met, who was ill. She had heard this from Augusta Willis in November, mentioned in passing as part of a larger accounting of the community's condition. A chest ailment, Augusta had said, not improving. She thought about the arithmetic of a man who has built himself around leverage, finding that his leverage has a boundary and that the boundary is winter and that winter does not negotiate. She waited. The waiting ended on the 17th of January. She heard the barn door latch before she saw who was working it, the clumsy, repeated contact of hands not responding correctly to what they were asked to do. She knew that sound. She had made it herself coming down from the barn wall in December, her hands 3 minutes past their working limit, fumbling at the access door with fingers that had opinions about their own usefulness. She went to the door and opened it from inside before he managed it himself. Harlan Aldrich stood in the doorway. He wore the same good wool coat he had worn when he came to the Voss farm in June. Well-made, expensive, completely insufficient for a mile of open road and 17 below zero. His face was a color she did not like. Grayish-white at the cheekbones in a way that told her he had been outside longer than was wise, longer than a man his age should be outside in that cold without better preparation. He held a small leather purse in one hand, with the rigidity of a man gripping the last form of something that still belonged to him, holding it not because he expected it to be useful, but because setting it down would mean admitting he had nothing left to hold. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the doorway and breathed, watching his breath disappear into the cold air behind him, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on that face. Not the crisp authority of June, not the cold assessment of the man with the satchel and the organized documents. Something stripped of all that. Something much simpler and much harder to look at, the expression of a man who has run out of alternatives and knows it, which is one of the few expressions that cannot be performed convincingly because it requires having actually run out. "Come in," she said. "Close the door." He came in. He moved to the small table on the main floor and sat down with the careful movements of a man whose hands and feet were not yet fully his again. After the cold, and she set a tin cup of hot water in front of him. The closest thing she had to tea water heated on the soapstone that sat at a temperature between warm and hot and was sufficient for this purpose. She waited while he wrapped both hands around the cup, and the color began returning to his face by degrees. She did not fill this silence. It was his silence to fill, and she had learned over the course of the autumn that people said more useful things when they were allowed to arrive at them in their own time. He told her about his wife. Her name was Margaret. He said this first as though the name was the thing that mattered most, the thing that would explain the rest. Margaret had been ill since November. What had begun as an ordinary chest ailment in the first weeks of the cold had settled into something deeper and more stubborn, a persistent fever that would not break fully, a cough that kept her awake through most of the nights and left her too exhausted by morning to eat. She was losing weight that she did not have to spare. The doctor from Ellsworth had come out on 2 occasions when the road was passable and had said on both visits the same thing. She needed warmth, consistent warmth, and nourishing food broth. Soft-cooked things that she could manage when her appetite was poor. Something better than the crackers and cold storage apples that were all that remained in the Aldrich household by the 3rd week of January. He said all of this in a voice that had been controlled into evenness at some cost. She could hear the cost. She had listened to enough people at that table over the autumn to recognize the specific quality of a voice from which feeling has been deliberately removed because the feeling cannot be afforded in this particular moment, in this particular place. He set the leather purse on the table between them when he had finished. "Name your price," he said. "Whatever it is, I will pay it." She looked at the purse. It was good leather, well made, the same category of object as the wool coat, a man who spent money on the things that signaled his position in the world. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. She reached across and moved the purse to the side, not contemptuously, not with any particular emphasis, just out of the way you move something that is not relevant to the question currently on the table. She opened the ledger to a fresh page and smoothed it with her palm. "The price is the same for everyone who comes to this table," she told him. "It is not paid in money." He watched her hand on the page. He watched her dip the pen. His face had the quality of a man who has prepared himself for several versions of this conversation and is discovering that the version he is in was not among them. "You will sign a document witnessed by Sheriff Crane," she said, "releasing the bank's claim on the Abernathy property, the full 160 acres free and clear title, transferred to me. You will also write a letter to the county judge stating that the foreclosure on my family's farm was executed against a debt that is hereby forgiven in full. Both documents properly witnessed before I give you anything from the cellar." The silence that followed had texture to it, the particular density of a silence in which a great deal of thinking is occurring very quickly. He stared at her across the small table, and she watched him run the arithmetic, watched him reach the end of it and start it again, watched him reach the same end a second time. "You are 18 years old," he said finally. His voice had lost the controlled evenness entirely. He said it the way a man names a fact that he cannot find a way around, cannot argue with, cannot reframe into something more convenient, a fact that simply sits there being itself. "I know how old I am," she told him. He looked at her for a long moment. "Then that would ruin me. Not a protest, not an appeal for mercy, or a negotiating position. A plain statement of fact offered the way a man names a thing when the pretense of bargaining has been stripped away and only the truth remains on the table between them." She set the pen down between them. "Your wife is ill, Harlan." Not a threat, not an ultimatum, a fact placed alongside the other facts already present. The ledger, the purse that was not the currency required the pen, the clean page waiting. She said it the way her grandfather had spoken when he was being most honest in the evenings at the kitchen table, when he was saying something that mattered without emphasis, without drama, in the plainest possible voice. Just the statement of what was true, placed where it could not be avoided. He sat with it. The barn around them was quiet in the way barns are quiet in deep cold, a contained, insulated quiet, the sounds of the outside world muffled by the snow in the distance. The soapstone in the corner ticked as it cooled. Outside, the wind moved against the walls in its slow, persistent way. She waited without impatience because impatience would have been the wrong instrument here, and she had learned over the autumn to match her patience to what the situation required. He reached for the pen. He wrote the letter to the county judge first. His handwriting was less controlled than it would have been at the bank on an ordinary day, slightly larger, the lines less level, but it was legible and it was complete. He stated that the foreclosure on the Voss family farm had been executed against a debt that the bank was hereby forgiving in full, that the family's title should be considered restored as of the date of the letter. He stated it plainly, in the language of a man who has written many legal documents and knows how to say a thing so that it cannot be unsaid. He signed it. She wrote the document concerning the Abernathy land herself in 3 plain sentences, the conveyance of the property, the terms, the date, and pushed it across the table. He read every word with the focused attention of a man who reads documents for professional reasons and does not sign anything he has not fully understood. His eyes slowed at the final clause, the one concerning mineral and water rights conveyed along with the surface title. He read it twice. Then he pulled the document toward him and drew a thin, clean line through that clause. "The surface land is what we are discussing," he said. "The mineral rights stay with the bank." He said it with the first trace of his former composure, returning the professional reflex of a man who has spent 30 years finding the negotiable edge in every transaction, the instinct firing even now, even here because it was so deeply embedded in him that it did not require good circumstances to operate. She took the document from his hands. She looked at the line he had crossed out. She crossed out his crossing out with 2 firm strokes that restored the original text. Not 3 strokes, not a scribble. 2 deliberate lines that said, "This is what the document says, and this is what it will continue to say." She set it back in front of him, picked up the pen, held it, looked at him without speaking. He looked at the document. He looked at the line she had restored. He looked at her face, and whatever he found there, steadiness, she supposed, or the particular quality of someone who has already decided and is waiting for the other party to catch up, settled something in him. The last negotiating instinct quieted. He picked up the pen and signed. She sent word to Sheriff Dwight Crane the following morning through Elbert Crane, who was no relation to the sheriff but was making a supply run to Promise, and agreed to carry the message. Dwight Crane arrived at the barn before midday on horseback, his face reddened by the cold, wearing the wary expression of a man who suspects he is about to be handed something complicated. He had worn that expression in June, too, sitting on his horse in the Voss farmyard while Aldrich presented the foreclosure documents, and she had noticed it then, a decent man doing a legal thing, aware at some level that decency and legality were not always the same thing and not always comfortable companions. She set both documents in front of him on the table. He read them slowly, without hurry and without comment, the way Crane read everything, moving through each sentence, as though he intended to be able to recite it later if required. When he reached the end of the first document, he set it to the side and read the second with the same thoroughness. Then he looked at Aldrich, who was sitting in the same chair he had occupied the previous day, and he looked at Idella, and he looked at the documents again. He took the pen she offered him. He signed both documents as witness, his signature steady and clear, the handwriting of a man who has signed his name to a great many official things and has never felt the need to make the signature decorative. He set the pen down. He looked at Aldrich one more time with an expression she could not entirely read, not judgment, not sympathy, something more neutral than either the look of a man noting a fact for the record. Then he wrote out, without saying anything, beyond what was necessary, and what was necessary turned out to be very little. The law that had arrived in June with a satchel and an efficiency of manner had just witnessed its own reversal, and had the decency to do so without making it into a performance. She watched him ride up the county road and disappear over the first rise, and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was gratitude, not for what he had done today, which was simply his function, but for the fact that he had done it without making it harder than it needed to be. When Crane was gone, she went down into the cellar. She took her time with the basket. A full cured ham, the best one remaining, the one she had been saving without quite acknowledging she was saving it. 6 jars of the chicken broth she had put up in September, the kind that was rich and golden and carried warmth into a person the way ordinary broth did not. A sick woman, she thought, could take this in small amounts through the day and feel the warmth of it moving into her. 2 pounds of dried beans, a measure of flour, a piece of salt pork, a small jar of the preserved plums, not because it was in the terms, but because a woman who had been eating crackers and cold storage apples for weeks would benefit from something that tasted of summer. She assembled the basket with the same care she gave every basket she assembled for every name in the ledger. The same measure, the same attention to what would be most useful. Not more than she would give anyone else, not less. This mattered to her, and she was precise about it even now, especially now. She carried it up and set it on the table. Aldrich looked at the basket for a moment, not at her, at the basket. She looked away because what moved across his face then was private. The kind of thing that should happen without a witness, if it possibly can. She went to the door and looked out at the flat, white January landscape, the county road disappearing into the distance, the fields on either side of it bare and windswept, and holding the cold the way flat ground always held it without any shelter to break it. She had looked at this view every day for 7 months, and it had become familiar in the way that difficult things become familiar when you live inside them. Long enough, not comfortable exactly, but known. She heard the chair move behind her. She turned back. He was standing with the basket in both hands. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. A long moment, long enough that she understood something was being said in it. Something that was not going to find words, because the words were not available to him for this particular thing. Then he walked out of the barn and did not look back. She stood in the doorway and watched him go. Harlan Aldrich walked away across the white ground toward the county road, a figure getting smaller in the January brightness, carrying a basket he had not been able to buy with money. The cold came in around the edges of the doorway, the same cold she had climbed through in December, the same cold that had tried to stop her and had not managed it. She let it come in for a moment and felt it on her face, and then she went back inside and closed the door. She wrote his name in the ledger, the date, the terms, the basket's contents itemized in her small, clear hand: ham broth, beans, flour, salt pork, preserved plums. The column for labor owed she left blank. She stared at the blank for a moment, the only blank in the entire ledger, and thought about what her grandfather had said about keeping honest books, about accounting for what people had to give and what they needed in return, and about how some debts were real and genuine and still could not be expressed in standard terms. She left the column blank. It was the most accurate accounting she could give. She closed the ledger. She sat with her hands flat on its cover and let the quiet of the barn be what it was. The land was hers, 160 acres of the Abernathy place free and clear, the Voss farm unencumbered. The debt that had crushed 3 harvests was gone. The document that had erased her in June had been erased by a document signed at the same table where she had been feeding people all winter, on terms that asked something real of everyone and protected everyone at the same time. She did not feel triumph. She wanted to be precise about that, because triumph would have been the wrong feeling, and she had tried in her life to feel the right feeling about things, which required some honesty about what a thing actually was. What she felt was the completion of an equation, the moment when a long calculation finally arrives at a number that accounts for all the variables. Her grandfather had built the principles. She had built the application. The winter had done the rest, in the way that winters do things, without reference to what anyone wanted, without hurry, without mercy, and with a thoroughness that left nothing unresolved. She went down into the cellar alone. She did not bring a candle. She descended the stairs in complete darkness, her hand on the rail. Each step placed with the deliberateness of someone who has made this descent so many times that her body knows it without her eyes. At the bottom, she sat on the crate and placed her palms flat on the stone floor and let the cool settle around her, even absolute, unchanged by everything that had happened above it. 56 degrees. She did not need the thermometer. She had felt this temperature often enough now that it lived in her hands the way certain knowledge lives in the body, rather than the mind, available without effort, reliable without confirmation. She listened to the pipes, in, out, the slow, continuous breath of the system doing exactly what it had been designed to do in the darkness, in the cold, indifferent to January, and to Harlan Aldrich, and to the documents on the table above, and to everything else the world above had been occupied with all winter. Just the physics of it, just the warm air rising and the cool air entering to replace it, the differential that drove the circulation. The principle her grandfather had understood and built into the design and tried to give her, and had finally managed to give her across the distance of 3 years in his own death in one Kansas winter that had required the full receiving of it. She thought about him going underground at 15 in a Pennsylvania coal mine, about what it meant to spend 35 years learning a place by surviving it, about the specific quality of knowledge that comes from that kind of long, careful attention. Not the knowledge of someone who has studied a thing, but the knowledge of someone who has been present in a thing through conditions that were genuinely dangerous and has come out the other side with the thing's nature in their hands. He had tried to give her that knowledge across a kitchen table in the evenings of his last years. She had received it carelessly at first, the way you receive things when you do not yet understand that the person giving them will not always be there to give them again. He had given them anyway. He had given every detail, the depth, the notch, the two pipes, the temperature, the principle behind each measurement plainly and precisely, and without visible frustration at her partial attention, trusting the process and not requiring immediate confirmation of it. That was its own form of love, she thought, not the dramatic kind. The kind that keeps giving at the same quality of attention over a long period of time because the thing being given is worth giving and the person receiving it is worth the patience the receiving requires. She sat in the complete underground dark for a long time, without moving, without speaking, simply present in the thing he had built. And she had finished, and that had held through every extremity the sky delivered. Then she climbed back up. Margaret Aldrich recovered. Not quickly, it was a slow process, the kind of recovery that requires patience from everyone involved and that does not progress in a straight line. By March, she was well enough to sit up through part of the day. By April, she was walking in the yard carefully with a cane she had not needed before the illness. By May, she was seen in town, thin, still careful in her movements, but present, which was the thing that mattered. Harlan Aldrich sold the bank to a man from Topeka in April and moved his household east before the end of the month. He did not come to the barn again. He did not send word. She did not expect either. There are transactions that complete themselves fully and leave nothing owing or unresolved on either side. No residue, no ongoing obligation, a clean accounting, a closed ledger page. That transaction was among them. She did not think about him often after he left. When she did, it was without animosity and without the particular satisfaction that might have been expected, because the outcome had never been about him. He had been a variable in the equation, not the point of it. February came and the cold began reluctantly, without enthusiasm, to lose its argument with the season. The temperature rose above zero for the first time in 11 days on a morning when the eve drip returned, and the air carried the faint memory of something that was not yet spring, but was at least the possibility of it. The county road became passable again. The rail line to Ellsworth resumed service. Goods arrived at the general store in quantities that said the worst was genuinely behind the community, not as a reassurance anyone offered, but as a fact visible on the store shelves to anyone who looked. Vera Garner came to the barn in the first week of February, not for food, but to talk. She sat at Idella's table for 2 hours, with her hands wrapped around a cup of hot water, and asked her questions that said she had been thinking carefully before coming. Not the practical questions about the cellar and the ventilation that most people asked, but questions about the winter itself, about what Idella had observed in the people who came to the ledger and in the people who did not, about what made it possible for someone to ask for help without losing something essential in the asking. At the end of 2 hours, Vera asked her the direct question she had been working toward. How did you know what to do? Idella told her about her grandfather, the coal mine in Pennsylvania, the root cellar on the Voss farm, the August afternoon he brought her down into it when she was 15 and tried to give her an understanding she was not yet ready to receive. She told it plainly and in order, the way her grandfather had told things, without dramatizing, without the elevation that makes a story more satisfying and less true. When she finished, Vera was quiet for a moment, looking at her cup. My husband wants to dig one, Vera said. That was the beginning of what happened next. Philip Garner came the following day with a diagram sketched on brown paper and questions that showed he had been thinking about this since October, since the afternoon he had stood at the bottom of the cellar and pressed his hand against the shoring timber and felt it hold. He asked his questions in the order he had prepared them, systematically, with the patience of a man who had decided to understand this completely or not at all. She answered each one as precisely as she could, going back to the principles when the specifications alone were insufficient, making sure he left with both the floor and the ceiling. He came back 2 days later with Elbert Crane and a farmer from the east side of the county named Holbrook, who had heard from Crane that something was worth hearing. She went through it all again: the depth, the notch, the two pipes, the candle test, the temperature differential, the reason behind each element. She took them down into the cellar and let them feel the temperature themselves, and press their hands against the shoring timber and hold a candle near the low pipe and watch the flame. By the middle of February, 4 families were actively planning cellars. Each person adapted the specifications to the particular conditions of their land, asking her questions as they worked through the adaptation. And she answered the questions and trusted them to apply the answers, because her grandfather had told her that the best teaching gives the other person enough to continue on their own, and not so much that they become dependent on you to interpret what they encounter. Temperance Bly came in late February, a woman of perhaps 50 who farmed alone south of Promise, and who had the direct manner of someone who has been making decisions without consultation for long enough that she has stopped finding it remarkable. She came with a diagram and very specific questions about high water table clay and what adjustments the specifications required. They talked for 3 hours. Idella showed her the cellar, let her examine the shoring and the pipes, told her about the east wall collapse and the lesson it had carried. "Why does the notch matter?" Temperance asked, standing at the bottom of the stairs with her hand against the timber. Idella told her what her grandfather had told her, and then she told her about the collapse and about rebuilding in the rain with the ruined timber around her, because the collapse was part of the answer, the part that could not be told without telling it. Temperance nodded slowly, the way her grandfather had nodded when he understood something with his full attention rather than just the surface of it. "The knowledge costs something to earn," Temperance said. "That's what makes it stay," Idella told her. She charged nothing for any of the instruction. Her grandfather had not charged her. What he had given her, he received as a gift shaped by 35 years of underground work delivered across a kitchen table in the evenings of his last years, and you could not put a price on that kind of knowledge without damaging something essential in it. The knowledge was meant to be used and passed on, and the passing was its own form of payment. The arithmetic her grandfather had trusted when he sat across from a granddaughter who was not paying sufficient attention and gave her everything he knew anyway. The spring of 1885 came in with a generosity that felt like acknowledgement, as though the land understood what the previous year had asked of the people working it and was offering what recompense it could. The snow receded from the fields in March, revealing soil that was dark and rested. The planting that happened in April had a different quality from ordinary hope. The people who planted had been through something together, and they knew it. And the knowing was present in the way they moved through the fields and spoke to each other at the fence lines, a shared reference point that had not existed before September. Idella returned to the Voss farm in the first week of April. She walked the 300 acres from corner to corner, the way her grandfather had taught her, pressing the ball of her foot into the soil at intervals, and reading the density of it, the drainage, the particular quality of the bottom ground that told you what the land could carry and what it could not. The land was good, dark in the bottom fields. The soil rested and ready in the way of ground that has been left alone through a hard winter and has had time to consolidate itself. She went first to the root cellar her grandfather had started behind the main barn. His shoring was correctly notched, his work holding exactly as he had built it to hold undisturbed through the winter without her. She spent 3 days completing what he had begun, sealing the pipe joints with clay and ash, finishing the shelves with boards she squared and cut herself, adding a second entry ladder with handrails because the steep steps were dangerous when your hands were full, and she intended to use this cellar for a long time. On the 3rd day, she went down into the finished cellar with the dairy thermometer and hung it on a nail on the earthen wall and lit a candle and held it near the low pipe. The flame bent. She sat on the bottom step for a while in the cool underground air and thought about her grandfather going underground at 15 in a Pennsylvania coal mine and spending the better part of his life learning what the earth held, and then the years of effort to give that learning away to a granddaughter who was not ready, who would not be ready until the emergency arrived and forced her to go looking for what had been left inside her. He had planted it in soil that was not ready and had trusted the soil would be ready eventually. She had been the soil. In September, Cecilia Voss came home from Ellsworth. She came on the morning train and walked from the station with her bag, arriving at the farm in the late morning when the light was good and the kitchen garden was showing the last of its summer abundance. Idella watched her mother come up the road and did not go to meet her, understanding that this arrival required its own pace and its own approach, and that going to meet her would change it in some way that would not be an improvement. Cecilia walked through the gate and up to the house and stood on the porch for a moment before she opened the door. She went through the rooms one at a time. Idella could hear her moving through the kitchen into the front room down the hall. Moving slowly, a long time in the kitchen. The particular sounds of a person touching things to confirm they are real, that they are where they were, that the absence has not rearranged what was left behind. When Cecilia came back to the kitchen doorway and saw Idella standing in the yard, her face had a quality that Idella did not try to name. Some things did not need naming. They stood looking at each other across the yard for a moment in the September morning light, and then Cecilia said, "Show me the garden." They walked the garden together for an hour. Cecilia asked questions about what had been planted, and when, and what had come in well, and what had struggled. And Idella answered, and it was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all. And by the time they went inside for the midday meal, something had been established between them that had not been there in June. Some new terms, some new accounting of what they each had to give and what they needed in return. Signed without paper and held to without discussion. Cecilia planted the kitchen garden that October. She put up 30 jars of preserved tomatoes and beans before the first frost, moving through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone restored to work that is genuinely hers, not assigned to her, not performed for someone else's benefit, but hers in the way that work is yours when you have chosen it freely and done it long enough that the movements have become part of how you occupy your body. One evening near the end of October, Idella found her mother sitting at the kitchen table after supper with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and her eyes on something outside the window that had no particular form. Just the darkening fields. Just the ordinary end of an ordinary day. Cecilia did not notice her daughter in the doorway. She was simply sitting, not grieving, not worrying, not holding herself together against something. Simply present in the kitchen that was hers again in the evening. That was hers again in the life that was hers again. Idella went back down the hall and let her mother have the quiet. The years settled into their ordinary patterns after that. The county recovered with the thoroughness of a place that has decided to continue. The sellers multiplied. Philip Garner's went in that spring, then Elbert Crane's, then Holbrook's. Each one adapted to its particular ground. Each builder coming to her with questions as they encountered conditions the original specifications had not anticipated, and working through the adaptations using the principles she had given them alongside the measurements. By the end of 1885, 7 cellars were operating in Holt County on the design her grandfather had developed in the coal fields of Pennsylvania and tested in the Kansas ground behind the Voss farm barn. Temperance Bly came in September of 1885 to report that her cellar had kept through the summer with the temperature steady through the worst of the August heat, that she had stored enough to carry her farm through 2 winters, if it came to that. She came to say it the way you tell a teacher something the teacher will want to know as the completion of something that had begun in conversation and deserved to be finished in conversation. "Your grandfather must have been a remarkable man," Temperance said. Idella thought about this for a moment. He was ordinary in almost every way, she said, except that he paid attention. He paid attention to what the earth was trying to tell him, and he paid attention to what was worth passing on. Those two things together are rarer than they should be. After Temperance left, she walked back through the barn and down into the cellar and stood at the bottom for a moment in the cool, even air. The thermometer on the nail read 56 degrees. She checked it the way she always checked it, not because she doubted it, but because checking was what you did. Because maintenance was what kept a system functioning, and maintenance required the willingness to check even when you were fairly certain of what you would find. The flame of the candle bent toward the low pipe, steady, unhurried. The same pull it had made on the first day she tested it in August of 1884, when she sat on the crate in the summer heat and felt for the first time what her grandfather had been trying to give her, and understood that she had been given something worth the receiving. In the summer of 1905, A young man came from Topeka on behalf of a newspaper running a series on the 1884 grasshopper year. He had followed a thread from the county courthouse, a property transfer, an unusual document, a name that kept appearing in accounts of that winter from people who had been present in it. He sat at the same table where Aldrich had signed his documents 20 years before and asked questions for most of a morning. She showed him the cellar. He went down the stairs and stood on the stone floor and looked at everything. The shelves, the pipes, the thermometer on its nail, the shoring timber along the walls. When he came back up, his face had the quality she had seen on many faces over the years, standing at the bottom of a cellar and feeling the temperature and understanding what the temperature meant. "How old were you when you built it?" he asked. 18, she said. He was quiet for a moment. He told her he thought what she had done was remarkable. "What I did was practical," she said. "My grandfather paid 35 years for the knowledge. I paid one winter. That is not a fair trade, and I have always known it. The remarkable part is that he gave it to me anyway when I was not paying sufficient attention and trusted that I would eventually." He wrote it down. She watched him write and thought about her grandfather at his kitchen table in the evenings of his last years, the coffee cup in his hands, the unhurried voice, the patience of a man who understood that the most important things cannot be said quickly and that saying them correctly matters more than whether they are received correctly in the moment of saying. He had known she was not fully listening. He had told her anyway. He had given her every detail: the timber work, the two pipes, the thermal mass, the distinction between cold and even plainly and precisely, and without visible frustration, trusting the process the way he had trusted the earth, not because he required confirmation, but because the material was worth the patience it demanded. The reporter noticed the gloves on her hands when she took him down into the cellar, worn through at the left thumb, dark with decades of oil and earth, and the particular substance of a life spent in hard work. "My grandfather's," she said. "He wore them in the coal mines in Pennsylvania for 35 years. Then he wore them starting this cellar. They have a good history in them." He wrote that down too, and she watched him write it and thought that it was probably the truest thing she had said all morning. She kept the cellars stocked and maintained through every season for the rest of her years on the Voss farm. She replaced the shoring timbers when they showed softness. She cleaned the ventilation pipes every spring. She kept the ledgers current through all of it, the accounts of every transaction that passed through the farm, the fair terms and the dates and the careful itemized columns that represented not charity, but a community's honest accounting of what it had to give and what it needed in return. She taught each of her 3 children about the cellar, the way her grandfather had taught her, the practical way, bringing them down the stairs and showing them the timber work and the pipes and the temperature and explaining the principles, making sure they left with both the specifications and the reasons behind them. She was a better teacher than her grandfather had been in one specific sense. She knew which part of the explanation the listener was most likely to receive carelessly because she had been exactly that listener, and she took particular care with the notch and with the 2 pipes and with the distinction between cold and even, which she taught not as a fact but as a principle, along with what happens when the principle is ignored. On a morning in late autumn, many years after the reporter's visit, she went down into the cellar one last time before the winter closed in. The knees were not what they had been. The hands found the rail more deliberately than they once had, taking it firmly rather than as a courtesy. At the bottom, she stood still and let the cool settle around her, even absolute the same as it had been in August of 1884, and every August and every January since. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the shoring timber nearest her. The notched interlocking frame she had rebuilt in the rain and the dark after the east wall collapsed with clay in her hair and 3 ruined timbers at her feet, and the full weight of what she did not yet know pressing down on her with a clarity that only failure produces. She had rebuilt it correctly the second time, because the collapse had given her the ceiling, had given her the principle that the specifications alone could not give the understanding of why the notch mattered, that she could not have arrived at any other way. The timber was solid. It had not moved in 40 years. It would not move now. The thermometer on the nail read 56 degrees. She stood there with her grandfather's gloves warm against the wood and listened to the faint movement of air through the pipes and out steady continuous, The same slow breath it had been making since August of 1884, when she first tested it with a candle and watched the flame bend and understood that she had built the thing her grandfather had designed, and that it worked as he had said it would work, and that she had finally, after everything it had cost, received what he had been trying to give her. It held. It always held. She pressed her palm against the timber one more time, feeling the solidity of it beneath the worn leather of the gloves, and then she climbed back up the stairs into the autumn morning and latched the trapdoor behind her.